Thanks for coming. All right, day 2. How's it been so far? Mostly thumbs up?
Yeah, the lunch was ridiculous.
Ridiculously awesome, right? It was good. Oh, I thought it was okay. Free lunch is good lunch for me, though, so that's good. Well, this is a free talk, too, so hopefully it's worth what you get. So this is Flux, my adventures, 1.21 gigawatts. I'm Jake Trent. I work at a company called Pluralsight. I did see in the little grab bag there's a month-long trial for that. So the trial is for what is our main product, which is a collection of professional training for devs, ITs, and creative type people. So that's us. Most of the content is like online videos. Online videos and assessments is kind of where we're at. So I'm pretty new there. We are starting to do some Flux and React coming from Angular at that shop, and then I'm coming from Instructure where we've done a lot of React and kind of our own flavor of Flux. So who here has done any React.js? Yeah? Awesome. So I would maybe say a third of the room. So this talk is going to have a lot of concept on Flux. So not knowing React isn't necessarily going to be a barrier, but you will see some code that is React code that might look slightly foreign to you, and we can talk about that a little bit or answer some basic questions, but this does have a little bit of presumption that you know something of React. So what is Flux? So Flux is an effort that's coming out of Facebook. It's really just a pattern for organizing the state in your React.js app. So if you're using React.js for your client-side app and you are having long-running state in your client-side app, Flux is supposed to help you manage that state. So it's a pattern. There's really not much to Flux. So when you go to npm and you install Flux, you're actually getting very, very little. So of the things that are included are these two, what's called a dispatcher and an invariant. And then your code is really here. And if you look at what this is, this might be a couple hundred lines of code. There's really not much there. So what you do is really just follow the pattern of, this is the recommendation on how we write Flux application. It's not a lot of code. It's not like saying, here is a framework like Ember, for instance, and giving that to you as kind of an all-in-one package. It's an idea of here's how you write your code. And we're going to talk about my adventure, my particular very imperfect approach. There isn't a perfect one, so that's obviously an imperfect approach because there are actually lots and lots of different implementations. So what I'm going to show you here is hopefully as vanilla as it gets. So when I started learning Flux and as a part of this talk, I wanted to show a little bit of my journey and just have the most vanilla thing, the most reference implementation kind of implementation that we could have. So we're going to talk about what all of these pieces are as the parts of Flux. So has anyone seen a diagram about Flux that kind of looks like this? Or is anyone? OK, so just a few people. So this is a really common kind of diagram. There's a few different flavors of this, but it's going to be something that you see quite a bit. And we're going to spend a lot of time here to talk about what the concepts are. Just a little refactor. OK. So the things that we should be seeing here are the code concepts, which are these things that we saw from the previous slide, and also the data flow, which is going to be represented by the arrows, the directions there. So if we start on components, this is the thing that most people who have done some React know something about. So React itself is actually providing you components. Now components are going to be those things that make up your user interface. And in terms of Flux, it's just going to hook in this relationship of how the data flows. So if you think of your UI here as components, it's going to get a few things. Like it's going to know about when changes to state happen, and it's going to get that model data. And then it's going to be pushing out any data that comes from the UI. So you think about like someone clicks a button to say, I want to buy this, or someone types their name in and says, my name's Jake Trent. Those things are going to flow out of the UI into actions. And we're going to follow the flow that way. In terms of actions, they're going to pick up all this UI data, and it's going to be able to be a list of just everything that the app can do. So this is really, it's kind of a loose set of all the possible verbs or the actions of your application. In kind of more general, or precise rather, Flux terms, these are called action creators, because these are functions that are called to do things, such as make requests or continue data changes. So here we are at actions. It's getting stuff that comes from components. So this is UI again, so UI data. And then the thing that comes out the other side, we're going to follow it to API helpers, is like something that we're going to persist, or something that we're going to ask for. This is like saying, if I click the button that said, buy this, this is calling a function that's the buy function here. And now we're going to like post to our shopping cart or something. That's where we're going. So here in API helpers, this is just the data access layer. So all of your like HTTP interface libraries are going to live here. And as it gets this data to persist, all it's going to be doing is making network requests. One interesting thing is that this is one of the few places that we still usually end up having async code inside of our Flux loop here. We'll see async code here with the network requests. So like, I'm going to push out an HTTP post and then wait for it to come back with the response. And then we'll see it again when we come over to the stores over here. That's one good thing about Flux, is it lowers the number of places, at least, that async operations happen, and gives you more synchronous code to be able to reason easier about. I'm just going to have to keep talking louder. Can you still hear me? OK, good. All right. I don't think I skipped one. OK. When an API has a response back, like when the API helper has said, I've been able to make contact with the web API and I'm coming back, it's actually going to hook back into some sort of action. It'll be a different action, usually. So if that first route that we took, buy button goes to buy, goes to a post to a shopping cart resource, this coming back is probably a different action, like shopping cart add success or something like that. Something that is asynchronous, remember, and then doesn't have to be attached to that original action. So it's going to come back with some data from the API. In our example, like this might be the new state of the shopping cart or something. Don't really know. What it's going to do is push its payload onto the dispatcher. So first it's going to wrap it. All the actions that go onto the dispatcher get wrapped in just a very consistent package that the dispatcher knows how to consume. It's like animating. Okay. Now the dispatcher is just a global message broker. Like all the messages for the app of things that are happening as actions, they go through the dispatcher. So it's that wrap payload that comes in, and it's the wrap payload that comes out. And you might wonder, like, well, why do we need a dispatcher if we just have things coming in and going out? It's a layer so that these actions don't need to know about the stores, because those could be like many to many. We could just know about one dispatcher. And the dispatcher also allows us a couple interesting things. So one is it dispatches all payloads to all stores. So this allows us to be able to depend on different stores. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as a part of the stores. But once all the messages get to the stores, stores can decide how interdependent they want to be with one another. So you can think of a store as like a fat model. So it holds all of the domain, both the domain model and the domain logic. And this is going to be like the shorter term data store in comparison to like a backend data store, which is going to be permanently persistent. This is going to be where your data lives for your app for the length of that browser session until you refresh the page, kind of thing. So all these messages are going to be coming in from the dispatcher. They're these wrapped action payloads. And the stores know how to read all of those payloads as well. So they're going to be receiving all the change events, like something was added to my shopping cart. That's kind of the scenario that we're using right now. And then it'll get all of the data that's associated with those events. Once it gets all those things, it's going to store it. It's just going to hold on to it. So some interesting bits about stores is they might receive all of the dispatched payloads, but it's going to filter and only listen for the payloads that it cares about. It can also defer. This allows, like, by being able to listen to all of what's coming through to all the stores, we are able to defer payload handling and wait for other stores. So an example that comes from the Flux docs, if you start reading about their chat example, I believe it is. Their chat has the idea of chats and unread chats. So unread is kind of like a derivative data type of just a regular chat. So if they have one store for each, the unread chat has to wait for the chat store to update before it knows, okay, I'm ready to update my unread chat store. So any type of like derivative or related data could potentially have to wait for other stores to resolve. That is, I think, one of the more complicated bits, or kind of even harder to program bits of the model. So we talked about multiple stores and that they're cohesive around the domain. There's a lot of question about, like, well, when should I make multiple stores? It's really up to you. There's a couple places where it might make sense. If you have this idea of dependent data, like store A relies on store B, and then B relies on store A, in order to break that cycle, you might have to have a store C that both stores rely upon. Another reason of why you might have multiple is just in trying to design your system so that each of these stores is very cohesive around what it does, what it stores, and what it does. You might want to split your stores there. So Bill Fisher, who's one of the major contributors to Flux reference implementation and the ideas from Facebook, he says, if you discover there are actually multiple non-overlapping domains, you have a good case for breaking that store into two. So it's kind of a good rule of thumb. Once we make it to the stores, we're ready to go back into the components. So each of the stores is going to say, I just changed, and here's what I changed with. Well, actually, no. It's going to say change first. And then this guy is going to say, OK, what did you change with, and be able to fetch that model data into its component. So you can imagine if we said buy, and then we hit this action layer, and it said, OK, we're going to post HTTP. That message comes back, like the post worked. Now my store, like let's say it's a shopping cart store or whatever, it now has all of these items in. This can now pull and update how my shopping cart looks, or put a different state on that buy button, whatever it happens to be. So that's the flow. There's one other bit that isn't part of Flux as a discussion, but as you write interesting front-end apps, like you're probably going to have a router there as well. And I see router as being incorporated into this as this is like the starting point, right? I change URL, ask for different UI state, and this is where I start entering the Flux cycle. So it happens actually simultaneously, at least in my implementations, where it'll render. And there's also likely another place where we say, not only do we render, but we need to also start asking for the data that goes in that UI. So that's what this arrow is. So one of the main selling points of Flux is that it is unidirectional, that there are fewer places that you have to expect code to be updated from. Or like there's fewer places that state will come from, or there's fewer places that you have to worry about interacting with. You'll notice that like each piece knows about relatively few other pieces. So like your law of Demeter is really nice here, where components only has to know about a couple parts of this system because of the way that the data flows and the way that it's layered. So we're going to look at a couple CRUD flows really quick. So when I wanted to learn Flux better, I thought, well, I'm going to do something like super simple, like just a CRUD app that knows how to create a book, how to list some books, how to get one book, how to update it, and how to delete it. So I did a little books administration app. So it ends up, for me, the file structure looking like this. Now, file structure isn't Flux specific or anything like that, but these are kind of the files. You'll see that this, we're just going to talk about, well, I guess we'll talk about a couple different ones, but this is the component. You'll see API helper here, actions here, stores here. Constants here are just, as you're looking through the code in the examples, you'll see I have to match events up. So these are mostly just event names so that they're consistent on the subscriber and the listener ends. And then also I'm using React router in the examples, but you could use whatever router you want. So we'll do a couple quick examples and then see how it feels to you guys. All right, so this is essentially the loop that we had before, just flattened out. So it's going the same way. Hopefully it still reads OK to you. So we have a router that transitions into a state. This is the code down here. The router is going to render. It's going to make a call to render that component, whatever it was. And then transition here is the action, like I am going to this place. In that transition, we're saying, OK, we're going to go find the list of books. That was like the route that we went to. So in transition, we're going to say, if there are not any books in my store already, I'm going to go fetch them. And then this is fetch. This is going to look a lot similar to any sort of HTTP something that you're doing. So I'm doing a request to fetch that stuff. And then when it comes back, I'm going to take the thing that came back and I'm going to push it into a new action called fetch success. That action is simply going to package it up, wrap it up into this thing that the dispatcher knows how to talk about. And this is really the most important, really the only required field for the dispatcher, is that there's this type, and it comes from some shared, these are essentially like, well, I guess we could just say that they're message types on the dispatcher. So that becomes important because on this side of the dispatcher, the store is going to say, OK, I've registered a callback. I'm going to get all the payloads. And I'm going to pull out that type from the payload. And then if it's one I care about, I'm going to save those models, because I know that will be coming across. And I'm going to say that I changed. Once I say that I changed, the component is able to ask for that change. Because a component, remember the router, it said, go render this thing. And when the thing went to render, it's going to add a change listener. It's going to say, when that store changes, I'm going to do something. So the thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this store and I'm going to find that specific thing I was looking for. So here, in the case of a show, this is like we're showing one book. I'm going to say, what is the state of my URL? I'm going to go find that book out of the store. And I'm going to save it for myself. That's what setState does. Does that make any sense as a flow? Questions around that flow? I had to do this for weeks before I figured it out, so there probably are after a couple slides.
Is the bookstore.find, is that like essentially like a filter?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. Yep, this is essentially just the predicate of what I'm looking for. Sorry, I'm looking at my shadow, so I don't know if it's actually working for you well or not. Okay. Has my pointing been off this whole time?
If you were looking at the wrong thing.
Okay.
I figured it out.
Try to bring the shadow and the finger together. So yes, this is the thing I'm looking for. Essentially the filter here. I think underscore has like a find where. It would work the same way. Okay. Great question. All right. Let's do one more flow. This flow is actually large enough that I broke it into 2 slides. So we're going to create a book in this case. This is the create page. And then I believe the next part of the flow is create save. So this is going to be how do I render the page, and then the next will be how do I take what I just entered and push it into the API. So again, we have a router transitions into our space. We're calling the same action. We're rendering a different component. That component is now going to say, I am rendering, and I want to tell Flux that I'm rendering. So this is going to start that loop going. So remember, component talks to action. So the action takes that and it says, OK, dispatch this to all the stores. And the store is going to say, OK, I see that you're creating something. I'm going to initialize my internal book that we're going to be working on to nothing. So this is like a fresh state. Like you just asked me to create something. Let's start from scratch. And then here in that create page view, we're going to say, we've started listening previous when we mounted. And then we're going to say, OK, I just heard from the store that it changed, so I'm going to go get that book. And this book should be empty at this point, right? We're at a fresh form. We're going to create a new book on this form. So this is the second half of that flow, where on the form, somebody has clicked a button or pressed enter or something, and now we're submitting the form. So we're going to go through, this is React, where we're going to say, OK, go into the DOM and get stuff out. Get all that data out of the form. And then on line 3, sorry, I wasn't going to do that anymore. On line 3, we're going to call the create action and send it that entire object. So whatever that book looks like from the form, we're going to send it into the action. And that action is simply going to proxy on to the API helper. So now we're going to do some network requests. So here it is. We're doing the request. We're sending to the internet what we just received. And then when we get it back, and it's presumed successful in this example code, we're going to say, OK, it came back OK, and now we're back on the action train. And we're going to send it what we just got back in the response. So that action gets dispatched. So you see there on line 3, the important line, we're of type create success. And then in the store that cares about this particular event, it's going to say, OK, I care about it. And I'm going to save that book inside me. So this is inside the store. And I'm going to set some state here, as this is fully created now. And then I'm going to say, I'm changed. You don't necessarily care how, just that I've changed. And then the component can say, OK, I've said that I'm going to listen for your change. And now I'm going to pull out what I care about, which is this right here. So you'll see, imagine a flow where once I create the book, if it was created, I'm going to transition to the show page. So now I'm off the form, and I'm just looking at the kind of the read-only version of that page. Any questions about that particular flow? Yeah?
So if you wanted to share multiple components between views, stores,
OK.
how would you decouple the components from the stores so you could reuse them?
Decouple the components from the stores.
So right now the components are where books create store and books stored. But if you wanted to swap out that store in the component and use that component over multiple stores, how would you do that in Flux?
So there's so in React, so if you're saying I want to use a different store in this particular component, is that what you mean? So the way to get parameters into a React component is by passing props. So that's their name
so
for.
You could inject the store.
Yeah, you could push the store in. That's one way. Or you could create some sort of like component factory that's like create store or create component with store kind of thing. Those are two ideas that come to mind. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
On the store, just the last slide back.
Yeah.
You were assigning essentially the book value from action model to the
Yes.
short book.
Yes.
Is that so that you have scope to it later?
Yeah, in this example, I don't even use it. So I'm not sure other than like when I get data back that says, hey, here's the book that you just asked me to create. The like interesting things that might come back from the request, the HTTP post, are like maybe on the back end, the database assigned an ID to that book. And now if I let it flow back through, I want to save the book in its last form with that ID or something.
I don't know React, but when you do a mid change, that seems pretty generic. How does the thing that consumes a mid change know what happened? Once you pass the data that you have?
It actually doesn't. So this is the thing that's listening to that. It's just said, I care. So it's saying, so this is our, let's see, what would this be? The save page UI component. So it has said, when I'm rendered in the page, I want to look at this store and listen for any of the changes that happen there. And when they happen, I want to run this code. And the code that we run is, I am going to, that is actually slightly incomplete because I don't show this, but I'm going to query the store and see what is in it. So the store says, I've changed, but it's up to the component to say, well, tell me about yourself. Like,
can you not accept parameters at that point to let
yeah, you could. It's not usually, like you could accept parameters here. You could have change events, push parameters. The code I've written doesn't. I don't know that I've seen any that does, but you could.
Okay.
I don't know how fluxy or not that would be. It would definitely still follow the direction. So if you push the change parameters, that would still follow the same direction. Yeah, interesting questions. And others? Okay. So we've got 15 minutes. This is the section where these are some of my subjective comments on how I've liked it, what's worked well, what I think I'm not sure about, what I might try to adjust. So take all of this as super subjective. Again, like everything in Flux pretty much is, so nothing different. Okay, so components. So if you've ever done React without Flux, your components, which are supposed to be UI only, tend to not be just UI. Like you tend to end up putting a pile of business logic in there, not necessarily a ton. Some code even puts the network requests in there. Like if you're just working off of that one abstraction of React, everything's going to go in your Vue component. So they feel clean again. Like you saw, our business logic got pushed into the store. Our API helpers have all of the network. Then the actions and dispatcher kind of help facilitate those layers. So having just views again makes it feel like components just have the right stuff. So it's really awesome. On the actions, sometimes I feel like this is a slightly superfluous layer, but I do. I have eventually valued the consistency that it's helped me feel. So actions, since they're the things that the app does, obviously the app is doing them all the time. So actions as a thing that you would import into code modules, those are imported often. But the other things can be imported much less often now. Like my components don't have to know about the dispatcher, or they don't have to know about the API helper, or the store doesn't have to know about the API helper. The pieces, there's usually only just a couple pieces that any part of Flux needs to know about. Stores-wise, I think the synchronous methods are awesome. So as soon as like the data, now part of the stores are asynchronous, right? Like when the dispatcher says, call my callback, and we get the data, like we don't know when that'll happen. But once the data is in there, we can use stores like it just has the data. So as soon as we get an emit change, we just query it for the data, and it should be there. We can ask for it directly. There's not a bunch of callbacks littered around our code for asking for this data. It makes it feel really clean. One thing that we didn't talk about in the code examples, but maybe just a little bit conceptually, was the idea of wait for. So this is where stores can depend on other stores. This has been helpful. In some of the Flux implementations that you'll see, the dispatcher has actually been removed, which is actually to say that some people don't think that this is a valid or a useful case or something that you could code around in different ways. So your mileage may vary on that. Bill Fisher, at least, has written a few blog posts trying to say, well, this is why we needed stores for non-trivial kind of apps where there were these data dependencies. So I've tried it with. I've thought about trying it without. I haven't done that yet. If you notice on the store, it doesn't have a setter. Like, there is a little bit of a path to get back to the store, but it's good to know at least that it's very consistent on where data flows into my store. So if I think of store as like the authoritative source of data, and I always am very disciplined in how data gets back into it, I can always expect it to come through that registered callback from the dispatcher. One of the things that I love about React is it's like a great abstraction for building UIs, for declaring these hierarchies of components. With Flux, you get a lot more stuff going on. It's a lot more complex. And some of what that initial feeling of like, oh, everything's so clean and straightforward with React is lost a little bit in Flux. But it's definitely balanced with the like, well, I've done it without Flux too, and as the React app grows, like those UI abstractions start bending at the seams a little bit, like trying to hold all this other stuff that UIs aren't supposed to do. So I think it still is a good trade-off to make in general. You also saw, it's not as apparent because I tried to put more things onto one slide to make connections easier, but as you're looking around Flux code, you will see usually quite a few files, which is good in that things are modularized, but it's hard to follow. Not only is the code in the files hard to follow, but like sometimes these events are somewhat hard to follow in comparison to just making function calls anyway. This is essentially just a repeat of what we've already talked about. The events, there's a fair bit of time where you're doing these lookups on your event types, like book post success, or I can't remember what it was called, but like you're like, where does that happen? Or like you do searches on, well, where is booksaction.create called? Well, it's good that one, you know what you need to look for. Like that's obvious because it fits into the structure. But it's also a pain because it's spread out. It's spread out just slightly more. I have noticed that it requires discipline and consistency in the pattern to make it worth it. Like you can just be more confused with more stuff if you don't actually follow it, so it's more predictable. You also notice that there's 2 event sets that are tracked. So the stores register callbacks to make that jump from dispatcher to store. And then the views register as listeners with their own callbacks to make that jump from store to components. So that feels pretty complex as well. So a few things that I'd like to experiment with is, one is like these create flag, like is created flags. They feel kind of clunky. I'm not really sure how to, because essentially what I'm trying to do is show the state of the store with some more interesting methods than just like ask for the book, see if it's there. And plus, I also need something that's like at a change event, I can go ask it for something. So this is, anyway, feels slightly clunky, but try to experiment with that. We didn't talk a lot about the metadata, like paging information from APIs, but currently I store that in the store. So when an API helper says, here's your page of books, and here's the place to the next page, I store that all in the store. And the interesting thing is right now, my actions actually talk to the stores to get that data back. And if you think of where actions sat in relation to store, like it's actually on the other side of the circle. So I don't know how to get around that yet, but it feels slightly not conforming to that direction of Flux. There are many libraries that do some interesting abstractions around these kind of lower level things. So you saw like we're implementing a switch statement, or we're doing a package for a dispatcher call like every time in every function. There is quite a bit of boilerplate there. And it would be interesting to implement some of the abstractions either from those libraries or from my own. So it used to be that it was really hard to learn Flux. There was just a lack of real world level kind of examples. Like there was literally like 2 examples. Well, for a while there was just one example, which was a to-do app. And then people complained and Facebook put out a second, which is a chat app. And now there are many, many from the community of people that are trying out different ideas around Flux. So to me, it feels a little bit like the Backbone days where it's like, well, figure out how Flux works for you. Like, you know, Backbone had a fair amount of fill in the blank opportunities, and here where, you know, invent all your code, like it is a very large blank. And then this is the next effort from Facebook, which is an idea of Relay with a little query language and data specification language called GraphQL. And this is what they're touting as the next iteration on Flux. It's slightly unclear to me what the relationship will be. It sounds like there will be some Flux plus Relay or some that are just Relay. So I think they're saying Flux is still a thing, but Relay gives you a lot. One stark difference is Relay will have one store that everything will talk to, and GraphQL is a way for you to, on your components, say, here's all the data that this component needs in a declarative way inside the component. And then it also is something that requires a backend that's compatible with GraphQL as a strategy. So if you're looking at other Flux implementations, there are many. Here are some, like check again tomorrow, there'll be more. That makes sense for the stage that we're in, which is like, hey, we're figuring out this is like generation 1 of Flux implementation. So if you want to do some more learning, Google search will get you a long way. Here are a few interesting resources that I've found. This one I found more recently. It's actually pretty cool because it's a bunch of code, not just blogs with code snippets. These are like full, I think they did the to-do app in several of those libraries listed. So I hope you will. It's really interesting, and React is awesome, but it needs something to help it. And Flux is, I think, very fitting for React in the way that React works, and is generally a great pattern. So go check it out. Thank you. If you want to give any feedback on anything today from the session, it's on Joined. And if you want the slides, they're here on Speaker Deck. And then some of the code that I'm working on does not match the slides 100% at this point, but it's going to be right there on GitHub/jtrent. What questions do you have? Yeah?
So have you run into any issues with multiple components using the same store where, like, let's say I have a book list component,
Okay.
because the number of books in it,
Okay.
and I have multiple of those on the page.
Okay.
And I'm just kind of keeping track of the state of all these different list components, which aren't really, just the books themselves.
So what's the problem? I have multiple components on the page, and they talk to the same store.
Yeah, and you're all interfacing with them. You have to, like, you have this extra layer. I mean, the alternative I was thinking is you have like a component of a book list, and it knows what books it has, right?
Okay.
But and you can have multiple of these, and they each keep track of their own books.
Okay.
But when you have it all in a singleton store, you have to worry about keeping track of these separately within that store. So.
Yeah, I'm still having a little bit of trouble seeing what the problem is, because as I'm imagining it, each one of those 3 book list components, is listening to that store, and if they're just showing a list of books, every time that store changes, all 3 of them should have listened for it in the same way and should get the update.
What if they're all separate? They all have separate lists of books, though. Like one is displaying a list of books for different people, for example.
So okay, so they have their own filter.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we go back to the slide where we took a moment and talked about the filter, that wasn't that one. This guy? I could imagine that like component 1 said, go to this store, which we all share, and then find whatever is specific to this component, and had some parameter to say, I can pull something, a subset of what that store knows out.
So that's where you do filter.
Yeah, you might think about doing one of those like derivative stores as well. Like if there's a top seller list or something of books, you could have that store wait for a bookstore, and the top seller list component could listen to just that top seller store. You could play with that. Yeah, cool. What else? Yeah.
Among the million libraries out there, do you have any favorites? And also, do you have any thoughts on isomorphism books?
Let's see. Of the libraries, which are my favorites? So I've heard good things and have done just a tad in Reflux. I think that's one of the more popular and older ones. Fluxor is, I think, older, but I think Reflux has more traction. And then this is from Yahoo. They're probably doing something cool. A lot of these are just from some guy, so having one from Yahoo, I guess, means something. I haven't used them, so I don't know. And as far as isomorphism, you can do it. With React, it's easier. It's still not free. It's still a complex problem, so I wouldn't do it unless you needed to for some compelling business reason. Or for fun. Yeah.
What's the debugging like? Is it easier than normal JavaScript or harder?
Well, debugging in Flux or React or both?
Both, yeah. The whole Flux package. You said the events can be difficult to trace. So.
Yeah, so I would say Flux, because of the events, probably makes it harder to just know when things will happen. But since you're always going through like a pretty well-defined path, like I think you can intercept it in the right places and know where it's been and know where it's going. So if you can kind of depend on your discipline, I think that helps. As far as like debugging React proper, like it's awesome because a React component is literally just a function that spits out what could be termed as just like a representation of the DOM, which at some level is just like just like a blob of, let's say it's a string or whatever. Like some people do testing on string output from renders. So I think it's really, really good to be able to say what logic in my component might have broken and how do I debug that. That's easy. The thing that's maybe less easy is any of like your HTML debugging. I don't know. That's
trade-offs.
I don't know. That's pretty good. Like React is awesome for debugging and testing because it's just a function. Like just put a breakpoint in there. It's just JavaScript. I guess one thing that makes it harder is like if you're using JSX, which I recommend and I use when writing my components, like you will have a compile step there where it'll look slightly different when you go to use it. So you might be needing to use like source maps or something like that to make debugging a little more clear. Yeah. Any other questions? One more?
This is more just generally, I guess I'm curious in your opinion on learning React and Flux. Should you take those one at a time, or
Yeah, I would.
what do you?
Yeah, I would do just React as kind of like, how do I create views in React? And then as soon as you start doing like pages or multiple pages of things, I would start looking at Flux. I would maybe almost try it like without Flux first, and like hopefully that's painful. I think it will be, and you'll want to use Flux on top of that. So I mean, you could not have the pain and just use Flux, but as far as concepts to learn, I'd do React first and then Flux. Some people just do, I'd probably, if we were to break Flux apart, I'd probably go from like React components to stores to actions, API helpers, then dispatcher last. I'll go in that order. Yeah. OK, great questions. Thanks, all. Hope you had a good time.